So I'm in the middle of the process where I'm essentially preparing a production session to go to mixing. So this is a track that was produced by a good friend of mine by the name of Benjamin Barilli. He's a producer, an artist as well here in the Toronto, Ontario area. And I did all of the vocal tracking, vocal tuning, and I've been mixing all the material that he's been doing. On this particular one, I actually did these drums as well. So he brought this song, this production as an idea, and he basically had lots of samples laid out, but the main drum elements weren't brought in yet. So that's something that I contributed to this, in addition to doing all of the vocal recording, tuning, alignment, all of the above. So where are we with this song? Well, after the tracking session, I think it's always a good idea to get a really, really great sounding solid rough mix together so you kind of have the intent of the song, and then from there we need to refine it. One interesting note about this session is that because it was kind of not completely done, and because we're having to deal with all these weird restrictions and scheduling conflicts with the current state of affairs with the lockdowns, we ended up leaving a lot of this stuff as MIDI. Now, generally, when I work in a tracking session, my dropout protection is medium, and my device block size is 32 samples. That gives me around just a little above 2 milliseconds of round-trip latency, and this system handled that perfectly well. So this is where we are. We've done a little bit of cleanup, and I want to talk about the next steps that I would take to get this going. Now, I don't have any clearance to play the vocals, but we can play the main hook at least, or a couple of the different elements. So I'm just going to let you have a quick listen to this track. It's got a real cool vibe to it, really interesting chord progressions, and what the vocalist ended up doing with it in terms of the top line was pretty awesome. Okay, so like I said, when I'm pre-mixing and doing a rough mix, I'm not afraid to lay some plugins or different effects on something, but I always have to kind of make sure that I'm ready to commit, or that the producer is ready to commit to some of those things. And in some of those cases, that's a yes. And in other cases, maybe we're not quite sure. So for this one over here, I might revisit this, or for this one over here, I might revisit some of these EQ choices that I made, because I tend to do things pretty quickly when I'm mixing a rough. But in general, the main thing that I want to do is all of these instrument tracks that are sitting here, I really, really, really need to get these into audio that's either been transformed or printed. Now, one other thing I want to mention is that in this particular case, I have access to the production session or the tracking session, and I'm essentially going to create my mix session from this session. But in other cases, you might be sending this to somebody and giving them a brand new clean slate to start with. In that case, it is really worth looking into some stem exporting videos. I have one that I've already done, and I'll make sure that I link to that in the description and an info card above. But if you haven't explored that, it's very easy. We can export stems, and we can choose between channels and tracks. This is something that I go into great detail in my video. But essentially, that would be a very, very easy way to be able to get a discrete element for all of these individual tracks that you want them as channels and you want them as audio. It's pretty much just setting the cycle range, selecting what you want. You can give a file name prefix, choose your format, and then you have the ability to export them. They're going to go into their own subfolder, and then you could pretty much just zip that and send that off to somebody. But in this case, I actually just want to convert this production session into the mixing session. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go File, Save As. Now I know there's an actual name. I just called it Turn Signal because there's a turn signal sample in the actual song. I'm going to rename a session over here, and I'll probably go -mh mix. I'm going to leave it in the same folder. You could also do this with versions, but I prefer doing an actual save as in this particular case. So with all this set, I'm just going to click Save As. Now this is going to update the current session that we're working on. So now we're starting from a clean slate. Okay, so some things that I like to do. Well, anytime that there's samples that are laid out like this and there's lots of individual chops, these could potentially get moved. I could accidentally mute one or unmute something. What I would generally like to do is make sure that I'm in a snap mode. And then I just want to, I always like to use bar boundaries, which is good because Studio One's kind of smart. And if you're zoomed out, it's snapping to different bar boundaries. So first and foremost, anything that's an actual audio sample, like for example, this one over here, that's a sample. These are samples that have been cut and laid in. And in the same case with this one, we have delayed snare, same thing here. So what I would like to do in this case is I'm just going to render these to audio. Now, like I said, I always like to lock on to a bar boundary. I'm just going to highlight everything across here. Oops, I got to suspend my groups first. And that's the first step I'm going to do. Is it anything that's an audio file? I just want to essentially render that. Now, when you have muted events and you have gains and everything, if you make a range tool selection like I'm doing over here, then you don't have to worry about that. These will all be rendered together and any muted events are not going to show up. Now, for some other things, before I do this, let's just talk about this really quickly. I'm going to zoom in here. Let's have a quick listen. And let's have a listen to the sound. For certain elements, especially if they have handles, this particular one doesn't have handles, but for certain things where I might want to revisit the fade, and if there's only like 3 events and they're cut on a grid and I don't really see any issue or potential errors coming up, I might just leave that in place, and maybe this one as well. Especially if there's event effects that are being used, I would definitely consider leaving them in place. But let's just say for now, I'm going to leave these 3 as they are, but all of these other ones, all of these, I'm just going to make a highlighted range selection, and then it's just going to be Command B, and that's just going to render new contiguous audio events. I can do a data zoom so I can see everything really, really nice and clearly. I don't have to worry about accidentally moving one of those samples or anything like that. Okay, next up, let's take a look at the virtual instruments. So these are the drums that I did. I'm just going to enable my group really quickly. We can have a really quick listen to these. When you play them against the actual percussion and the samples that were already laid in there. Okay, so for these ones, I want to do something slightly different. I'm pretty OCD when it comes to my virtual instruments, track names, channel names. So I will generally name each one of these instruments after the element that they're using. And depending on, sometimes I'll use sample one instance of sample 1 per each sound, and sometimes I'll end up using Impact XT. In this case, though, I just ended up using sample 1. So for these, I'm going to suspend all my groups just for a moment. And one thing I want to make note of is when we do something like a transform to rendered audio, it's going to see these as individual events. So I'm going to delete the muted events. And the one thing I can do is I can just highlight all of these. And if I click G, this now just creates kind of like a contiguous instrument part. So now if I choose the render option in this case, then what ends up happening is that it will render this as one file with whatever tail that I give it. I'm just going to make sure that my solo safe is not selected here. So now with these, I can literally select all of these. I can right click and I'm going to choose to transform these to audio track. And the main reason that I want to do that is just in case I need to revert back for anything. I'll give you a really quick example. Sometimes you may end up not tweaking the release properly and you've rendered like a sub bass or something. And you didn't hear it in the mix, but you hear all this clicking when it gets time to mixing. If you use this type of workflow, you have a little bit of a safety net, or you could at least access the MIDI. That's the other thing. If you want to do any sample augmentation, you have the MIDI there. It's a really great option. In terms of what options to use, in most cases, I really like to get something dialed in, and if there's something like saturation or something like that, then it becomes part of the sound. So I can render the inserts, I can preserve this state, but I also have the option to remove the instrument. This is really good because it means I kind of have a safety net, but I'm leaving off with where I want to be, which is with audio files. Now, auto tail or fixed tail, I'm just going to set this to 5 seconds. And you know what? I'm pretty happy with the way all of these sound as a starting point. So I'm going to leave the render inserts option enabled. We'll preserve the state, and we're going to actually remove these. So these will be replaced with audio tracks with the fader at unity gain, which is another thing that I really like because it allows me to kind of fine tune things in a nice way. But any sends that were brought up over here, they will still remain active. So if you have any side chaining or anything, it's really, really useful. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now you can see that all of these files are going to go off one at a time. So there's our kick. Next up, it's going to do the snare, then it's going to do the clap, and then it's going to do the perk. Now, when I work with sample one, I really like that 1-to-1 track to channel ratio. I don't really have to worry about multi-outs, or it's very easy. I can just render one of these at a time. And like I said, if we take a look at this, I had some sends on these. I have a parallel bus that has a clipper and a little bit of EQ. All of those sends are now on the audio tracks. And the other thing is I also had a side chain on my sub bass where I had sent the kick out. That has remained intact as well. So that's a really good option. Now, the other thing is, oh, maybe this is a little bug, but I'm just re-enabling my groups over here. This should have maintained the group setting, but it's not a big deal. Let's just make sure that the groups over here, we can choose drums. Now, these are all part of the same drum group. So if I do anything, they're all going to solo together and everything like that. Okay, I'm not going to talk as much now. I'm going to disable my groups again. Any muted events, I'm just going to get rid of them. We don't need the muted events. And then, like I said, this is really about gluing all of these together because I want to have a contiguous audio file when I render this. So we can do these three now. Now, in this case, I'm not 100% sure with these EQ filter moves that I did. And I really want to fine tune these against the kick once I mix it a little bit better and the sub bass. So in this case, I'm going to highlight all three of these, and I'm going to choose the same option to transform to audio track. But this time I am not going to render the inserts. So they will remain there live on the tracks. I'll preserve the instrument track state, and I will remove the instrument. So render inserts, we're going to leave the inserts active, but we're going to leave the other two options. And fixed tail, we'll leave this set to 5 seconds. That should be fine. So now we have 3 more tracks that were virtual instruments that are now being rendered. There's the first one. Second one is coming up. And then last but not least, we have our third one, which is our Labs synth. It's a great free virtual instrument by Spitfire. I always like to do a data zoom just so I can kind of really amplify things so I can see the waveforms a bit better. But all of my gain staging has remained intact over here. And you can see now the faders and everything like that, any plugins that I left. So if I need to change anything, I have that flexibility. Okay, let's talk about the sub bass really, really quick. A couple things that I noticed. I will sometimes leave something as a virtual instrument only in very specific cases. What I want to do is I am going to glue both of these together though. So I'm just going to click the G key, and it's created a contiguous instrument part. And this is obviously starting right on a bar boundary. So that's really helpful. I noticed here when I was soloing this out, this is going to be really hard to hear unless you're using headphones or a really good system. But if I was to play from this spot, I noticed that I feel like these settings could be refined in terms of maybe like backing off the release a little bit and dialing up the sustain. Bring the release up a bit. But that being said, this is also something that I would want to check with the producer. So if I solo out the kick and the sub bass, I want to make sure that the sub bass hits are leaving room for the kicks and everything, and also that it has to gel with the whole song. So for that reason, I'm actually going to choose to leave this as an instrument track. I'm going to book a Zoom call with the producer, hop on with him and say, hey, is there anything, can we refine this, or were you happy with where it was? And where it was basically, let me try to undo to get back. That's where we were. before I made those changes. So in certain cases, I'll leave a virtual instrument as a virtual instrument. This is not taking up that many resources, but it's definitely one of these things where I would want to make sure that the producer's intent is maintained before I just start making any changes or anything like that. Okay, so now that's basically it. I have all of these vocals. I've already done all of the tuning on these, and they've been melodined, and in addition, we've pre-mixed them. We put a little bit of auto-tune and a little bit of a signal chain that makes them sound good, some different effects. So I'm pretty happy with leaving those as is, and if I need to go back and change the comp or anything like that, I can still do that because I haven't even actually printed this yet. But I definitely would want to make sure that everybody is completely happy before I do that. We have some older vocals in here as well. I'm going to leave those just as is. But the main thing for me here is getting these virtual instruments sorted out. Now, I just see this one more instrument. Again, it's going to be the same thing. I'm going to highlight all the events. I'm going to glue it together. As long as this is residing on the downbeat of a bar, then that's good for me. The other approach you could take is even if you create an instrument part and it starts at like bar 17, that you could just pull it out so that your audio part, or rather the audio that's rendered, would actually start at bar 1, so you know that you don't have any timing issues. This is the last one that I want to do. In this case, we don't have any plugins to worry about. It's just it's kind of a cool sounding contact instrument. I'd never seen it before. Just different sounds, sound effects, and these are actually kind of blended into the actual track. So for this one, it's going to be the same thing. I'm going to right click. I'm going to choose to transform to audio track. I don't have to worry about the inserts, if I'm being honest, but sometimes what I will do is I will click this anyways because I want this to be rendered and I want my fader to come back in at 0, which really helps me fine tune things. So I'm going to preserve its state. I'm going to remove the instrument. Auto tail, we'll leave that set at a fixed tail at around 5 seconds. This is the last file that I now need to render before I could go over to mixing. So now, this has been set. Notice that because we chose the option to render the inserts, it snaps our fader at unity gain. Now, I can barely see this, so sometimes what I will do is I will actually turn up the event gain and then I will trim it down by an equal level. So in this case, Alt Option and the plus sign on your numeric keypad, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's just 24 dBs that I've turned this up. And now what I can do is I can trim this back 24 dBs. And all this is doing is just basically, it allows me to see the waveform in a little bit more detail. And sometimes I will do the same thing over here. So for this turn signal sample over here, I might go like this. I might turn this up 12 dB, but then come to the actual trim, and I might trim it back 12 dB. So just giving myself a little bit more resolution. Okay. And the same could be said for these. I'm not too worried about it, to be honest, right now. But if ever I need to, I just make sure that I do an event gain change followed by an input trim so that I'm not really changing the levels, but it makes it easier to see. Now, also worth noting that if we hover our mouse over here, we can do a data zoom. And I usually have my data zoomed in quite large. And the main reason for that is when I'm in a bird's eye view, when it's super large, it allows me to see the waveforms pretty easily. Okay. So now the only thing here that's sitting as a virtual instrument is this sub bass, and I have an 808 growl, which is kind of, it's just the mid-range content of this sub bass. So at this point, I've already worked with the producer. We did some virtual sessions, and we basically made some edits, and these were transformed. He rendered out some new stems that I just basically brought in and volume matched them. So everything is pretty good. All the editing is done. I have my live strings that are going to be mixed in here. We've done some really basic sound design on some of these tracks. At this point, this track is essentially ready for me to start mixing. And I have the benefit that if I need to go back, I can go back to it. I have audio files. I have the MIDI as a backup, but this is just a really, really good starting point. But like I say, the main difference here is that the production was done within Studio One and it's being taken to the next stage. It's remaining in Studio One. But if this was going out to another mixer, maybe he or she would be on a different DAW, Logic, Pro Tools, Nuendo, who knows, then I would definitely look into exporting stems. And sometimes if something is really, really messy, I might even do that myself and give myself a clean slate and new stems that I bring in where everything lines up at unity gain, and that basically equals the rough mix or the production mix. So from this stage, I'd be giving my ears a little bit of a break and then hopping into the mixing session, of course, after I do a meeting with the producer, just to double check about these bass MIDI parts or these instrument parts, just to see whether he wants to adjust those. But that's basically it, the workflow that I like to use. It leaves your session rather uncluttered. If I open this up, we don't have a bunch of instrument tracks that are not being used. I can get back to them at any given point if I need to, but I'm sitting with audio, and the other great thing is if I end up needing to recall this mix a little bit later on down the line, and maybe I don't have the same samples on my computer, maybe I'm not running the same software virtual instrument, it's very easy for me to be able to simply open this up because it's audio. Now, of course, if I tried to revert it back to an instrument part and that software instrument wasn't loaded on my system, I would have some troubles, but of course then I could just use undo again. And I can tell you that just somewhat recently, even last week, I went to recall a session that was done in 2015 or 2016. It was picked up by an artist, and I was asked to deliver the stems. And I had done a bunch of work really quickly, and I forgot to do this last step of kind of finalizing my rough mix. And I had to actually go in and search for similar sounds and rebuild some of the parts because I had no clue what patch I used. And those instruments simply weren't even installed on this new system. Anyways, that's all the time I have available for today. I hope that you enjoyed this content. If you did, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Any questions or comments, please leave them down below. I will do my absolute best to get back to you. And as always, we will catch you in the next video. Cheers.